Another interesting thing about this case is, I know you've mentioned it earlier and you've done episodes on it, is that ransom note. And I didn't really fully appreciate how many, I guess you could call it, oddities there are about that ransom note. Can you touch on some of the things that are kind of weird or interesting about it?
Oh, absolutely.
What do you mean that you didn't fully appreciate the oddities?
There was, like, I never realized that it was the longest ransom note in, like, kidnapping or FBI
In
history.
history, yeah. Yes, yes. That's perfect right there. And that's the thing is it, and also the circumstances of how it wasn't, it was left there with a body. That's never happened. But the ransom note is super long, doesn't ever mention her name. There was also again a practice note found that
Yeah.
was starting to address it as Mr. and Mrs.
Right.
But the note that we know it as it now
threw
is
that
just
away in the
Mr.
trash.
Ramsey.
Yeah.
So it was just like, oh, we need to focus on him. And some people will argue that it seemed like it was objective based to get John out of the house. It's very filled. It's filled with movie references where we did a whole
so many movie references.
we did a
to,
whole
like,
seen it game with Teddy for him to guess the references.
I remember learning that, Bobby. I was so I
That was
felt
fun. But there's
my brain
references to Speed, Dirty Harry, Ruthless People.
All
It's
kinds of
very.
movies.
It's not. It's as any seasoned investigator would describe it as basically like a ransom note you'd see in a movie.
yeah, yeah,
It's not a real ransom note.
yeah. And then for it to be like
amount.
splayed out on the stairs, even while JonBenet's body was like in the basement.
Right.
It's like, okay, so you guys just still left it there or whatever. And then not to mention that we haven't even begun to go into all the weird commonalities and details about the penmanship of the letter, along with other people, especially with Patsy Ramsey's handwriting, which I mean, we to this day, we still find things that we're learning new insights in. But you can, if you parse, like, and you look through it, there's like certain letters where, even the eyes, for example.
And she changed how she started writing.
She
after
did.
this whole ransom note. And also, but before we get into too much the handwriting, the amount of the ransom was also very odd because it was only asking for 118,000.
Yeah.
And supposedly this is for some foreign terrorist faction,
Which
that
also-
is, like, doesn't respect his business or whatever. We respect your business, but not the country it serves. But it's also a weird amount. It's a very people have tried to relate it to his bonus, which John has even kind of refuted in later interviews, like, well, that's something I offered up, like almost as if he was sick of hearing that the bonus theory.
But it's such a weird specific number, $118,000, especially for a family that, I mean, John's company had just crossed the $1 billion threshold as a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. And so this family was very, very wealthy. Their house had over 120 windows. Okay. And so
Is that true?
It was something like that, Bobby. Okay. But the point being is that, I mean, how many windows you got, Chris? I don't got 9. I got no windows. I live inside of a Journeys in a mall.
Same. Yeah.
It's a decommission mall. But the point being is just that they had a lot of wealth. So what is even $118,000? And why is that specific number? But then also with this whole ransom letter, aside from just it being so similar to Patsy's handwriting,
Sorry about that, Chris.
is that there it was so strangely written, like it's not like a real ransom letter. It's something that Mel Gibson would be holding in a movie.
That was in theaters at the time.
Which was the movie Ransom was in theaters. Yeah. And so it's just so it is weird. It is a very weird thing. And it's also one of those things where in this day and age, when you look at the Ramseys, when you see the Ramseys on TV, whether it's John Ramsey or his elder son, John Andrew Ramsey, which a lot of people had no idea they even had an older son that also had a bedroom in that house and who may have been there Christmas Eve, Christmas Day time.
Well, he was cleared.
He wasn't that cleared. He wasn't cleared, Bobby. But
he was cleared officially.
He was official channels, the same channels that we call into question.
Again, and this is part of our podcast, I want to say right now, there's discourse on it. We aren't all just like a hill, let's go after the Ramses thing. Our theories have evolved. And
we disagree.
He very much has this whole jaw thing.
I mean, I don't necessarily think, well, we don't even need to get into that. But the claim is that John Andrew Ramsey was in Atlanta at the time. But there are people who said that there might have been, because he was 21 or 20 years old at the time, that there were neighbors who said that they saw someone of a frame of like a 20-something-year-old man who wow,
Barnhill, the Barnhill.
Yeah, the Barnhill's another neighbor
the guy that
too.
stored the bicycle.
Yeah.
In one of the first articles, he's described that he was there Christmas Day.
But when it comes to it, I forgot my point now, Bobby.
You were being hung up on Jar. That was it.
No, it was more than that.
I don't remember. I'm
Well,
sorry.
I don't know because you interrupted me.
I'm sorry.
This is also part of it, where sometimes I have to fight for the respect I deserve, just to voice my opinion, just because he might be a little bit more comfortable, Bobby, with I don't know, the patriarchal system and just getting and just believing systems at their word. Sometimes I got to be the one to go, well, that's what they say.
The discourse. That's what we're about.
Yeah.
There we go.
We're okay with having conversation because that's also a thing. People have lost the art of conversation. You know what I'm saying? And it's not about necessarily agreeing with who you're talking to or whatever. It's just about getting ideas out there and maybe learning from each other and maybe accepting each other, and it's something that's really important for me because I've just lived most of my life without people really ever accepting me for who I am. And it's just something that I still work with every day. And no therapist wants to take on me anymore because they say that I don't bathe enough. I got too much poop in my cuticles.
Okay, that's enough.
And
Sorry, Chris.
it's
Continue.
okay. Chris poops.
All right, everybody poops.
You poop today, Chris? See?
Yes, I did.
See?
We're getting closer to his deepest, darkest secret.
Yeah.
One other question I had on the ransom note is the fact that you had mentioned the practice note that was found. Because of that fact, we can confidently say that hey, this ransom note was something, it was written, on the spot. So this wasn't like a note that if a perpetrator did it, they didn't bring it with them, which it sounds like that's kind of like a key thing regarding the ransom note and this case.
Absolutely.
Right, because it was written on Patsy's notepad.
Mm-hmm.
It was a notepad that was found in the house, and it was written with her marker as well. Mm-hmm. And John turned that over to the police when they asked for handwriting samples. He's like, "Oh, here's Patsy's notepad," and then he wrote some stuff for them. And they didn't realize until they were back at the headquarters meeting with the FBI, where they're like, "Oh, they got the note that it was like, hey, this ransom note was written on the same pad."
The same pad.
So they're immediately like, "Hey, we need to start getting a search warrant for the house."
Mm-hmm.
And within, I would say, 20 minutes of this all happening at the Boulder police headquarters, John goes and finds the body
in the basement.
And it makes it so the situation, which was now going to be handled by the FBI, has now been turned back over to the Boulder PD because it's a murder and it's now no longer kidnapping. Because it's like, oh no, the FBI guy got swayed.
Mm-hmm.
It's very conspiratorial when it comes to that. It could just be coincidental, but it is very suspicious that right after they were like, hey, we're going to get a search warrant for the house, start doing this things the right way with the FBI, that it's like, oh no, we found the body. Don't worry. Like it's still a murder. I'm gonna go ahead and throw a blanket on it. We're gonna contaminate this even further.
Yeah.
Just like that was done in the OJ thing too, which they were very aware of. All of the stuff surrounding that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
How different does the case become if John never finds the body right away, and this does turn into a kidnapping, and the FBI gets involved? Is this like a completely different case if that happens?
That's a great question.
That's a great question.
That's a great question, Chris.
I think it would have been a completely different situation where the family would have been properly sequestered to be questioned, and we would have gotten to the truth a lot sooner.
Yeah, and for the FBI to have jurisdiction in that instance, it's a different level of seriousness, especially in terms of the relationships or lack thereof that the Ramseys may or may not have with people who've got boots on the ground and are around them or are the first responders in this case. I mean, we delve into it throughout different episodes, but there are connections. There are, 6 degrees of separation between the Ramseys and people in the Boulder Police Department high up, or at least in the DA,
because that's the
district
thing. We want to
attorney.
keep it with the Boulder DA's office, who has a history of not taking things to trial, not convicting people, making back alley deals, and actually abusing the grand jury system to get the exact same outcome they ended up getting with the Ramseys.
Right.
So they knew that, like, hey, if this is federally, this would have been way different. So then
they
Ron
don't have the
Walker-
same relationship.
Ron
with
Walker
people.
asked Commander John Ella, like, hey, I can stick around and you can use our resources if you want. And John Ella, the same guy who warned the cops arriving, like, hey, treat them like they're victims. John Ella told Ron Walker, the FBI agent, he goes, no, we don't need you.
We don't need you.
We don't need you. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
You think you got this?
Right.
Your supposed first. It's very
interesting. It's not.
But yeah, the FBI would have been.
It's not the logical way you would think someone would respond, especially for resources, especially if their heart was in where it was intent in the same way that they described it was. There's things that feel like, oh, they almost indicate that these guys wanted to cover something up, or certain people did. Nothing is a monolith, you know. But if the FBI still had their hands on it, they probably would have been very. The Ramseys would probably really would have been fucked over, or in the sense of the kind of control they were trying to have. Because I mean, even after the body was discovered, and which then killed it from being a kidnapping case and put it back into Colorado, local jurisdictions. Even then, like the next day, later that day, they wanted to still get on the plane and fly. They wanted to fly to Atlanta. There were all these different things that the FBI would not have allowed them to do.
Absolutely, right.
And then would not have allowed them to, even stay. They probably would have been sequestered and put into different interrogation rooms, and more fucking things would have been figured out. Probably one of them would have cracked if we were to go along with the theory of them being participants in the cover up.
And it's interesting that they try to now portray like wanting, like, they try to portray it like the Boulder police didn't want the FBI involved and that they wish they would have been involved. And it's like the FBI actually still stuck around to assist, and then only officially bowed out when they saw this whole presentation and Alex Hunter was asked, like, hey, are you going to assemble a grand jury? And Alex Hunter, the DA at the time, said, I got to get back to you. It's a political issue. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
And for the FBI, the next day they told Steve Thomas, famous detective on the case, we can no longer be involved.
Yeah, they knew that this was radioactive. And that was what, a couple years later?
Yeah, that was in 98.
98.
98.
Yeah.
It was like June of 98.
So for 2 years, they were trying to give their assistance to basically, people who were basically saying, or trying to stonewall them in many ways, and then ultimately said it right to their face, like, well, this is a political matter for us, like whether we want to even go forward with this or not, And ultimately, I mean, did you hear the details from our podcast about the grand jury, Chris?
That was another thing. Did you guys mention how the grand jury, the narrative up until just kind of recently was that the grand jury didn't indict them, but that turned out to be false. They actually did say, hey, you should, indict these people on charges. And
they indicted the parent, and it was from like 98 until, no, it was 99 until 2013 is when it finally got revealed that, like, oh, they chose to indict.
Yeah, they voted to indict them.
Basically for assisting in, first degree murder. And for covering up something. They didn't release all of the documents of it, but they released, just part of the documents.
Yeah. But Alex Hunter, the same guy we were just talking about, the DA, he made the unilateral decision because that was his job.
Not to sign the true bills. Yep.
Yeah, to not go forward with those recommendations. And then he did a press conference where he basically made it sound like the Ramseys had been, what's what I'm looking for, Bobby? Cleared. And then that no one was going to get any information about this grand jury from anybody for basically in perpetuity.
He put a very tight seal
without a judge's order or some shit. And so, but then you look at like the year or so after, the Ramseys did a press tour for their book, The Death of Innocence. And you read inside The Death of Innocence and how they describe things and their whole media PR circus. Sometimes they try to do it without actually outright lying, and then sometimes they actually lie. But they always try to frame it to make it sound like they were acquitted and that they were innocent. That the grand jury
chose
said,
not to indict him. Lynn Wood straight up just lied. Where he's like, the grand jury's all the evidence, and they said they didn't want to indict. Like,
and for 15 years, that's literally the only official narrative until it was revealed through some, miracle practically around 2014 that actually no, they voted to indict.
Right.
They found him guilty.